Hi everyone, we're ready for day 4 of our daily reads. Today I'm going to read to you a book called The Twit. This was recommended by a very good friend of mine and one of our DBSJP teachers who left us last year to return to the UK, Miss Rue. So Miss Rue, this one is for you because I know it's one of your favourites. It's quite a long book, so I'm just going to read a few extracts from it and I hope you enjoy it. You might want to find a copy for yourselves to finish reading the exciting stories in here. Mr. Twit. Mr. Twit was one of those very hairy-faced men. The whole of his face, except for his forehead, his eyes and his nose, was covered with thick hair. The stuff even sprouted in revolting tufts out of his nostrils and ear holes. Mr. Twit felt that this hairiness made him look terrifically wise and grand. But the truth was, he was neither of those things. Mr. Twit was a twit. He was born a twit, and now, at the age of 60, he was a bigger twit than ever. The hair on Mr. Twit's face didn't grow smooth and matted as it does on most hairy-faced men. It grew in spikes that stuck out straight like bristles of a nail brush. And how often did Mr. Twit wash this bristly, nail-brushy face of his? The answer is never, not even on Sundays. He hadn't washed it for years. Mr. Twit is married to a lady called Mrs. Twit. Here they are on the front, Mr. Twit and Mrs. Twit. They get up to some trouble. Mrs. Twit was no better than her husband. She did not, of course, have a hairy face. It was a pity she didn't, because at any rate, it would have hidden some of her fearful ugliness. Take a look at her. Have you ever seen a woman with an uglier face than that? I doubt it. But the funny thing is that Mrs. Twit wasn't born ugly. She had quite a nice face when she was young. The ugliness had grown upon her year by year as she got older. Why would that happen? I'll tell you why. If a person has ugly thoughts, it begins to show on the face. And when that person has ugly thoughts every day, every week, every year, the face gets uglier and uglier until it gets so ugly you can hardly bear to look at it. A person who has good thoughts cannot ever be ugly. You can have a wonky nose, a crooked mouth, a double chin and stick out teeth. But if you had good thoughts, they will shine out of your face like sunbeams and you will always look lovely. Here's Mrs. Twit's transformation. Nothing shone out of Mrs. Twit's face. In her right hand she carried a walking stick. She used to tell people it was because she had warts growing in the sole of her left foot and walking was painful. But the real reason she carried a stick was so that she could hit things with it, like dogs and cats and even small children. And then there was the glass eye. Mrs. Twit had a glass eye that was always looking the other way. I'll let you find out about the glass eye for yourself. I'm just going to read you one of the tricks that Mrs. Twit plays on Mr. Twit. So throughout the book, Mr. Twit and Mrs. Twit play tricks on each other and they're very funny. The Wormy Spaghetti. Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. She chose long, big ones and put them in a tin and carried the tin back to the house under her apron. At 1 o'clock, she cooked spaghetti for lunch and she mixed the worms in with the spaghetti, but only on her husband's plate. The worms didn't show because everything was covered with tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese. "Hey, my spaghetti's moving," cried Mr. Twit, poking it around with his fork. "Oh, it's a new kind," Mrs. Twit said, taking a mouthful from her own plate, which of course had no worms. "It's called squiggly spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat it up while it's nice and hot." Mr. Twit started eating, twisting the long tomato-covered strings around the fork and shoveling them into his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his hairy chin. It's not as good as the ordinary kind," he said, talking with his mouth full. "It's too squishy. Ugh." "Oh, well, I find it very tasty," Mrs. Twit said. She was watching him from the other end of the table. It gave her great pleasure to watch him eating worms. "I find it rather bitter," Mr. Twit said. "It's got a distinctly bitter flavour. Buy the other kind the next time." Mrs. Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten the whole plateful. Then she said, You want to know why your spaghetti was so squishy? Mr. Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with a corner of the tablecloth. Why? He said. And why it had a nasty bitter taste? She said. Why? He said. Because it was worms! Ha ha ha! Cried Mrs. Twit, clapping her hands and stamping her feet on the floor and rocking with horrible laughter. I wonder what Mr. Twit will do back to Mrs. Twit. I hope you enjoyed that extract today. Find somewhere new to start your reading today. I'm here in my garden. It's nice to get some fresh air. Go out on your balconies, go in your back gardens, get some fresh air to break up your online learning. Have fun, everybody.